The Night Lords were originally the 8th Legion of Space Marines, created during the first founding and became one of the 9 traitor legions of Chaos Space Marines that betrayed the Emperor of Mankind during the Horus Heresy. They do not worship any of the 4 Chaos Gods individually, but acknowledge them equal in the form of Chaos Undivided, as they ruthlessly spread terror and fear amongst the galaxy's inhabitants. The Night Lords are experts in the use of terror tactics to win battles and demoralize their foes before the main combat even begins. Since the dark days of the Horus Heresy, Imperial scholars have pondered how the truest loyalty of many of the Legiones Astartes could have turned to base treachery, purest devotion to hate, nobility to wickedness, but for the Night Lords, perhaps their heart always belonged to darkness. Created with a higher purpose, perhaps then their end could have been different, but their history is one of poisoned ideology and atrocity. Even when they were counted amongst the loyal Space Marine legions, their nature and actions were ever questioned. Some argue that they were simply a function of necessity. The monsters needed to drag a barbaric age into the light. Some say that they were a mistake, a misjudgment compounded by circumstances. A few wonder if they were damned from the moment they were born, that they were destined never to be part of the future they would help to create. All such speculation is ultimately pointless. No matter the cause, the Night Lords are the creatures of horror and always were. The 8th Legion was soaked in blood from birth. The Legion's first recruits came from the linked prison sinks of ancient Terra. In vast caverns, filled with half-crushed ruins of millennia past, there lived men and women who had transgressed against the laws of their masters, condemned never to see the light again or breathe fresh air. They lived out their lives in fear and blind darkness. There was no law in these lightless lands, and survival existed only by the blade's edge. Only the strongest and most ruthless survived in these subterranean warrens, and those who did grew in cruelty and cunning, fed by a constant influx from the hive city above. The prison sinks were an ever-hungering gate of madness and murder. But of the millions who lived and died in these sinks, not all had been punished by the world above. Amongst the bloodshed and fear, children were born, cradled in the dark and raised amongst death. Those who lived over a standard decade were pale, silent creatures who moved without sound. The night's children, the prisoners called them, and even the most savage killers would not seek them out by choice. It was from these pale children that the Emperor of Mankind would create the first warriors of the 8th Legion, dour with skin so pale it resembled ash or powdered bone. They were far from their brethren legionnaires in manner and appearance. The gene seed of the 8th Legion had been well paired with the human stocks of its first recruits, and if anything, it seemed as if one had been made with the other in mind. Besides accentuating their paleness of skin, the gene seed gave the sons of the underworld the ability to see through darkness to a degree that far exceeded that of the other Astartes of other legions. This gift was also a curse, forcing them to see the light of suns and stars through filters and flare buffers. Even though they now walked in the light of the world above, the warriors of the 8th Legion always walked in the night. The first use that the Emperor found of his 8th Legion was to bring to heel those who believed that the sins of the past could live on in the newborn Imperium of Man. Several of those who had bent their knees to the Emperor had done so because they believed that this was the only choice. Others, having seen the empire of the techno-barbarian warlords rise and fall, believed that they were simply part of a temporary arrangement. Crimes against the New Order took many faces, from the Sargorian enclaves, whose gene atrocities continued in secret, to the psi breathings of the court of Antius and the March of the 10 Million. All showed that even in the face of all the Emperor's might, some would fall back into the ways of the old knight. When such crimes required no simple crushing, but retribution, the Emperor deployed the 8th Legion. Some such actions seem well suited for the 8th Legion, whether as a consequence of their genetic inheritance or the combination of their origins and indoctrinations. The warriors of the 8th Legion seem to have tended towards moral absolution and a drive to enact retribution. There was no shades of gray in the 8th Legion's moral universe, no degree of guilt or innocence. Truth and falsehood was as day is to night. Indivisible and unqualified, the dark was the realm of guilt, lies, and monsters, and those who dwelt in the dark knew only the language of blood, the message of swift and merciless retribution for their actions. Justice brought the light to darkness, and justice was neither warm nor caring, but as indifferent and cold as the edge of a knife. The warriors of the 8th Legion were creatures made to live in the dark and to fight a war for a future of light. In their core, they were warriors for a future that would have no place for creatures of their kind. At least, that is what those who knew the 8th Legion now say. Perhaps memory was too kind. Perhaps many wished to believe that there was a nobility in such monsters, where in fact, there was only horror. Perhaps many wished there to be a purpose behind atrocity. Otherwise, how could such creatures be suffered to live? It would be easy to say that the coming of Konrad Curze to the 8th Legion changed everything, that the fall of the Night Lords began at the moment the Emperor reunited his 8th son with the Legion created from his genome. But it would be truer to say that it was Nostramo that set both Curze and the Night Lords on the path to treachery. Curze was the gene sire of the 8th Legion, but he had two fathers, two hands that shaped his nature, and through him the fate of his legion. The Emperor who spun the substance of Curze's life, and the planet Nostramo, which had raised and taught him. What the Emperor intended for his son can never be known, but the nature of Nostramo can be. Nostramo was a bleak, sunless hive world of suffering, pain, and corruption, at the heart of a string of planets which had kept the ability to cross the stars through the Age of Strife. It was a world of sprawling cities, of smoke industry, and of sweat of millions. Nostramo's wealth, for wealth there was, laid in the seams of adamantium ore beneath its surface. Worlds far from Nostramo fed on its output, and the mines had long wormed deep into its flesh. Nostramo was perpetually dark due to its population-clogged atmosphere, and the fact that it circled a slowly dying star, whose light was unable to penetrate its gaze to reach the surface. The world was barely better lit at noon than at midnight. A shroud of perpetual darkness produced by a massive amount of toxic smog kept the planet swathed in dull grays and deep blacks. Only the rich could afford the Nostramo idea of illumination, which was little more than a dim blue illumination strip that was placed in the ceilings of the ruling hierarchy's luxurious dwellings in the spires of the Dark World's hive cities. The world had 5 major cities that straddled the habitable hub of the planet, named in sequence from Nostramo Prime to Nostramo Quintus. Each hive city functioned as a self-contained industrial system. Due to the synchronicity in the orbit of Nostramo and Tembor, the moon interloped between Nostramo and its dying sun, these cities experienced the equivalent of a Terran night, even during the middle of the Nostramo summer. Its cities were warrens of stone and iron, kilometer-foot-tall stacks pointed up at the perpetual night. Bridges of black metal crisscrossed the narrow ravines of alleys and streets. Cathedrals and factories grew from the forest of slums, and roofs crawling with gargoyles. Smog lay over everything like a cloak drawn around a dying man, turning what little light shone from windows and lamps into sickly hollows. Dust, smoke, and the reek of chemicals filled the air, and worked into the flesh of every man, woman, and child, trimming away their years so that the best that life could offer was a slow decline in grinding servitude, never glimpsing the brightness of hope or the warmth of true happiness. The physiology and genomes of the people that lived in Nostramo hive cities remained mostly identical to that of the baseline human from the Segmentum Solar, with the exception that none of the planet's people possessed irises. The visible part of their eyes consisted entirely of their pupils. The people of Nostramo were pale, and most were thin and gaunt, given by the turns to distrust, dark humor, and callousness. This acute form of albinism, though a recessive mutation, had become common in Nostraman population. The vast majority of the planet's people lived in poverty, as foundry laborers, while the rich grew in affluence, trampling down or simply killing outright any who dared oppose the status quo. Depression was an inescapable way of life for most Nostramans, and overpopulation was prevented not by war, disease, or legislation, but by suicide rate. The Dark owned Nostramo. Body and soul, its existence was a horror to equal any Xenos enslavement or nightmare of the Dark Age of technology. If there ever had been true laws, they had vanished long ago, eaten by the greed of the few and the desperation of many. Murder was the currency of life, and strength came from violence. Every sin, great and small, had its home in Nostramo's endless night. It had been said by those remembrancers who recorded its history after its reclamation that during this time, weeping and pleading were the sounds carried eternally in the wind. And every child grew to know that the only law was that of the knife, and that the only right belonged to the strong to do with as they will. Corrupt and murderous gangs, whether or not they were named as such, ruled every part of Nostramo, from the height of nobility to the lowliest alleys. Every inch of Nostramo was someone's domain, someone's territory, or hunting ground. In the slum habitation stacks, the gangs ruled by raw fear, killing and torturing as they pleased, fighting wars with the feral packs of outcasts who were closer to animals than men. It was said that many of these gangs ate the dead, treating their territories as a predator might a hunting ground. In the mines and factories which turned the planet's wheel of industry, the gangs went by names that echoed with a false authority. The Iron Overseers, the Hands of Corgado, the Sons of Toil. Slab-muscled and furnace-scared, they walked the streets, clanking with weaponry and reeking of murder, enforcing order that was little more than slavery. In the wealthier areas, the rake-heel sons and daughters of the corrupt nobility gathered in packs, clad in costumes like strutting peacocks, as quick to kill with blade or gun as they were to cast an insult. No matter what their station, almost all gangs owed fealty to one of the numberless barons, counts, or lords, who in turn served still more powerful men and women, many of whom stylized themselves with courtly titles that echoed of a long-forgotten nobility. Though wrapped in the trappings of birth, blood, and feudal right, there was no division between the rulers of Nostramo and its criminal overlords. They were one and the same, cruel monarchs of kingdoms built of sin. According to the heretical handwritten chronicles of his life, entitled simply The Dark, the Primarch Konrad Curze's earliest memories was descending from the heavens in a crackling ball of light to the night-shrouded planet of Nostramo. Unlike the other Primarchs, Curze was never adopted by a human family, and was forced to fend for himself in the terrible underhive of Nostramo Quintus. He spent his early life surviving off his wits and determination, feeding himself by hunting the feral animals that roamed through the vast hive city. Curze quickly established himself as a major power in the cities of Nostramo, and thanks to the countless atrocities committed by him against the world's criminal gangs and corrupted nobles, a semblance of law was eventually imposed upon first Nostramo Quintus and then the other hive cities. Nostraman society was transformed, and the ripples were felt all over the planet. Curze was eventually recognized as the planet's benevolent dictator. It is during this time that Curze earned the name Night Haunter for the vicious murders of literally hundreds, if not thousands, of Nostraman criminals and corrupt aristocrats. Almost a standard century after the Great Crusade began, the Emperor came to Nostramo. The coming of the Emperor of Mankind was an event that had been prophesied in Nostraman history, an event that would lead to the planet's downfall. Night Haunter quickly adapted to the teachings of the Imperium, studying the complex doctrines of the Adeptus Astartes under the Primarch Fulgrim's tutelage. Night Haunter was soon accepted as the leader of the 8th Space Marine Legion that had been created from his genome, which he named the Night Lords. Although he and his legion excelled in many theaters of war, a tendency soon became apparent. It never occurred to the Night Lords to use anything other than total, brutal, and decisive force to achieve their goal. Over the first few years, the Night Lords were molded by their Primarch into an efficient, humorless force, possessing the fanatical thoroughness of witch hunters. Night Haunter encouraged his legion to decorate their power armor with images designed to inspire fear in the enemy, a tactic that proved incredibly effective. Soon, rumors of impending presence of the Night Lords would cause a rebel star system to pay all outstanding Imperial tithes, seize all illegal activities, and put to death any mutants and suspected traitors. The reuniting of Primarch and Legion was the beginning of a spiral that would see the Night Lords descend further into horror and nihilism. After Curze's departure, Nostramo shook off its enforced peace, returning to lawlessness. From this point, Nostramo fed on the 8th Legion, not with the finest of its youth, but with gutter scum soaked in blood and cruelty. Some claim that this began to poison the Legion, twisting its purpose and making many Night Lords simply murderers gifted with the strength of demigods. This thesis, though willfully ignores a number of factors, no least of which was Curze's leadership of his Legion. That he came to despise his own sons is likely, but he was still their lord. Far from restraining the 8th Legion, he drove it on, bringing peace through atrocity to planet after planet. Sometimes there seems to have been cause of such methods, but often the only explanation for decimation of populations, for the skinning pits and crucified cities, seemed to be that the Night Lords enjoyed it. They became not necessary monsters, but simply monsters. Curze quickly began to lose some of the control he had over his Legion's innate savagery, and the visions of the dark future that plagued him increased both in lucidity and quantity. The Emperor had concerns about the actions of the 8th Legion, and the apparent instability of their Primarchs is clear, but what is not clear is what was done to restrain Curze and his sons. There was words, demands, perhaps even threats, but no action, no hand of judgment to throttle the Night Lord's crime. Why this was so is a question that can never be known, but now the Imperium was left only with the consequences. Of all the legions and their Primarchs, the Night Lords were the most sinister and the most suspect. The lack of moderation in the Night Lord's method had attracted scorn and hostility from other legions. Even as the tally of disgust grew, Curze became increasingly plagued by visions of ruin, calamity, and betrayal. He saw everything he had striven for be broken, the order and justice of the galaxy shattered, and his sons becoming monsters without cause or higher purpose. Curze became ever more withdrawn, what little shone in his being guttering to nothing, and leaving him with nothing but darkness and the screams of a lost future. Learning that his homeworld had slipped back into corruption, Night Hunter tried to confide in his brother Primarchs, but he had never been too close to them, and their reaction was less than favorable to his claims. Despite the fact that he spent much time with his peers, the Night Lord's Primarch kept himself at a distance, never able to join them or share in their joy. He still fell into convulsions, plagued by prophetic visions of his own death, of his Night Lords fighting wars after war with other legions. But despite the concerns of his companions, he would not reveal any more than dark hints of the cause of his tormented spirit. This feeling of isolation gradually grew into true paranoia, and the gulf between Night Hunter and the Brotherhood of the other Primarchs only widened. Events reached a head following the pacification of the Shurit system, a joint Imperial compliance action conducted by the Night Lords, Emperor's Children, and the Imperial Fist Legion. After confiding in his mentor Fulgrim of the terrible things he had foreseen, the shocked Primarch of the Emperor's Children repeated these grim tidings to his brother Rogo Dorn. Dorn took exception of the Night Hunter's slight of the Emperor's name with such terrible deeds and confronted him. The exact event of what occurred between the two Primarchs is not recorded in detail, but Dorn was found severely wounded and the Night Hunter's personal cadre of bodyguards slaughtered to a man. Curze then returned to Nostramo with his legion and fulfilled one of his visions. Curze's judgment was simple and swift. The Night Lords destroyed Nostramo. A few Imperial pursuit craft arrived just in time to see the Night Lord starship open their laser batteries into the hole in the planet's surface that had been left by the Night Hunter's arrival through the warp decades earlier. Nostramo's core destabilized and the world tore itself apart. As the Primarch and the Lord of Crusades, it was his right to liberate or destroy the world as he saw fit, but in the moment that Nostramo died, the Night Lords lost their last tether to restraint, though it would take the treachery of others to bring this change to light. This ruthless behavior did not sit well with some of the other Primarchs and the Astarte legions. Finally, Curze and the Night Lords were recalled to Terra to explain their behavior, where they were then reprimanded by the Emperor and the Council of Terra. The last straw of the Emperor was when the Night Lords had unleashed an exterminatus upon their own homeworld. Curze explained his actions to the Emperor by pointing out that Nostramo, in the Legion's absence, had slid back into the old ways of cruel violence and crime. He and the Night Lords were embittered by what they saw as the Emperor and the Council of Terra's hypocrisy, when they were censored by their brutality, even as the Emperor had unleashed a great crusade that used military power to forcefully reunite the scattered worlds of humanity. The Night Lords thought that the Emperor would acknowledge that their actions had been in the right. They also felt that these actions were the direct consequence of the mission that the Imperium had always tasked them with, which was essentially that to sanction terrorism against all who opposed the expansion of the Imperium and its mission to reunite all worlds of mankind across the galaxy. To Curze, it seemed that the Emperor had chastised him for carrying out the same actions that had once been deemed so vital to the Imperium's formation. Curze believed the Emperor to be a hypocrite, who was unwilling to face the reality of the means that his dream of human reunification actually required. Angered by the Emperor's rejection of their methods of protecting and expanding his realm, the Night Lords and their Primarch willingly joined the War Master Horus in his rebellion against the Emperor of Mankind. When the War Master revealed the treachery during the Isfan III atrocities and plunged the galaxy into the fire of civil war, Konrad Curze would eventually throw himself into a bitter campaign of death and destruction, giving full vent to his most violent urges. The Night Lords would participate in the epic Battle of Terra and the siege of the Imperial Palace by the forces of chaos. Immediately after the death of Horus, the Night Lords went on a killing spree in the eastern fringe of the galaxy that caused havoc for years after the Horus Heresy. The Night Haunter did not fall during the Horus Heresy, and neither did he receive the dark blessing of the ruinous powers, in the form of apotheosis and demonhood. Instead, he met his end at the hands of an assassin of the Calidus Temple named Mishen, on the planet of Tusculasa. It is known that throughout his life, Curze had possessed the gift, many would say curse, of foresight. He was constantly struck with powerful visions of the worst of all possible futures, and that his last had been a foretelling that he would die at the hands of such of an assassin. The prophetic psychic ability was passed on to the other Night Lords, who shared their Genesire's genetic heritage. This was a unique trait, as it's said to be unrelated to the warp taint or other known psychic properties. His death did not slow the Night Lords down, as they continued to apply themselves to his mantra, and are specialists in the application of terror and the tactics of fear to this day. Though they paid lip service to the ruinous powers of chaos, and certainly felt its insidious pull, in the end, the Night Lords, like their Primarch, serve only their own twisted conception of justice. After the assassination of Konrad Curze, the Legion splintered into multiple feuding warbands, as is the nature of those who serve chaos, and eventually relocated to the Eye of Terror. By the late 41st millennium, the Legion has deteriorated in both its numbers and capabilities. There was also continued infighting within the Legion, as there was no clear leadership, with several ranking Night Lords contending for the right to lead the entire Legion. Currently, the Night Lords hire themselves out as mercenaries and elite shot troopers for the forces of chaos, or even for pirates who raid Imperial worlds, such as Huron Blackbeard. They have been known to assist Chaos Warmaster Abaddon the Despoiler in his Black Crusade campaigns when asked to do so, as the quest for their own vengeance against the Imperium continues. Their most infamous post-heresy raid in the Imperium was on the world of Secundus Fall, just a few hundred light years from Holy Terra. Nearly all the raptors in the service of chaos originate from the Night Lords Legion.
Always used to put my freedom first in any situation.